This special is dedicated to Ice Shield facilitators Ray Headley, 1938 to 2024, and Joe Collins, 1952 to 2011, without whom the Ice Shield would never have seen the light of day.
Oh, Martin's bored.
No, sorry, I was up most of last night trying to sort out a PC, so sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm probably equally tired considering the amount of furniture moving that I did yesterday. So, and I've got another day of it ahead. So this record is a fantastic excuse for me not to be involved for the next hour or so.
Welcome, listeners of Illusions Temporal Discussion, the episode-by-episode Knightmare retrospective podcast. I'm Martin Harder.
Hello, I'm Paul McIntosh. I was the editor of the Ice Shield, the paper version, from December 95 to December 97.
And I am Jake Collins. I was editor of the Ice Shield, the online version, from July 2001 to July 2011.
And I've never been an editor of the Ice Shield. I have, however, been a reader of the Ice Shield.
Yes, I think that's the least we could expect. And here we all are for a very special episode of Temporal Discussion centred around the Ice Shield fanzine, which begins with a little icebreaker question from me to Paul. When Rosie and I discuss episodes from the first three series of Knightmare, our experiences, memories, thoughts and opinions, which still happens on quite a regular basis, a very important consideration we always talk about is, was this episode on the Paul McIntosh tapes? Now, Paul, do you know what we mean by that?
Yes, because I mean, we exchanged various tapes to try and sort of plug gaps in our respective collections. And yeah, it's a strange thing because looking back, it almost makes me feel slightly fraudulent to have created the thing in the first place because I'd seen every episode. But it's kind of inconceivable to anyone under the age of about 30 that you can see something and that's it. It's just gone forever. It's out there into the ether. And so I'd seen first two series. My parents got a video recorder, a VHS, some point in late 1989. So I suddenly had the ability to tape and rewatch episodes. So my knowledge is so much deeper from season 3 onwards. But I'd had big gaps in my knowledge because you can't just watch something once as however old I was, 13 or something, and expect everything to stick.
I used to amaze people, even of my own age, when trying to talk to them about Knightmare by saying it was never even repeated on CITV. Most things were, but those Sci-Fi Channel repeats were the first opportunity anyone had to rewatch it after the first air date. And those episodes your neighbours, Paul, recorded off the Sci-Fi Channel were so useful to me. You very kindly lent me the tapes and I copied them, and that was vital for many of my contributions to the Ice Shield fanzine, and I know you used to draw on those episodes a lot. So thank goodness for the Sci-Fi Channel and for your neighbours.
Yeah.
Although their attempts to record it were rather sporadic and jumping to the Asia Channel in places.
Oh, yeah, it was quite chaotic. It was such a strange thing because if I remember rightly, they replayed every series, didn't they, the Sci-Fi Channel?
I believe the Sci-Fi Channel did show series 1 to 8 all the way through in late 95 and early 96. And then they started repeating it in the summer of 98, and they got up to about the middle of Series 5, and their rights ran out.
Is that what it was?
Yeah. So they showed just over half of it twice, and the latter stages of it once.
So I remember, I may have told this story before, so apologies if I'm repeating myself, but looking back, I mean, I was very young, maybe 14-ish, and used to be in fairly regular contact with the team at Broadsword. I wrote to them and said I'd only ever seen Series 2 once. I can vaguely remember somebody winning the thing, but I can't remember the details of it. And they'd made copies of the master tapes. I think 4 random episodes from series 2, including Mark and Jason's winning episodes. And that was like such a treasure trove to get that cassette in the post, because I would have eventually seen them, whether that was on Sci-Fi or YouTube or whatever, but to get that as a child, and they asked for me to send the tapes back because presumably it was part of their, I don't know, archive or something. But that was such a big moment, because to suddenly have those and have those reference points at a time when I really felt like series 1 and 2 were such a gap in my knowledge, because I'd literally seen them once and never expected to see them again.
Now, I thought it might be useful, as we bridge into talking more specifically about the Eye Shield, to say something about memories of finding out that Knightmare had ended. But then I thought, well, perhaps that's not actually such a useful thing to do, for 2 reasons. One of them is, over the years and decades since Knightmare ended, I've discovered that not everybody has a big emotional story about finding out that Knightmare ended, like I do. The second reason is that, listening to an earlier podcast episode of Temporal Discussion, I didn't actually realise that the creation of the Eye Shield fanzine and the end of Knightmare didn't actually specifically have a lot to do with each other. I'd always imagined that Paul had started the Eye Shield as a way of continuing Knightmare after it ended. But as you explained, Paul, on one of those earlier podcasts, you'd had the idea brewing for a while, and that was just kind of how it worked out, that the Eye Shield came into being just after Knightmare finished.
I think there is an element of truth in both of those perspectives, really. I think, with no criticism at all of the people who were responsible for making the Quest. Sorry to clarify, I'm sure everybody listening knows, but the Quest was the official fan club newsletter. And I think the thing that always frustrated me slightly about that is it as any official output, it has a sort of party line element. There's never any criticism of the program. There's never anything other than just glorified promo, I suppose, with a few readers' letters and things chucked in.
It was the Club Nintendo of the...
It was, yeah. And I think that frustrated me in the sense that, my personal opinion, and I don't know all the reasons for it, but I felt that Knightmare, as it evolved and changed, it became less edgy and less unpredictable and less scary as it went on. And I think sometimes that was a point worth making, but you were never going to see in the Quest. So I think possibly when I made reference to having the idea of brewing, it was, I always had this thought, because fanzine culture doesn't really exist in print form very much anymore. But at the time, and certainly going back further into the 80s and earlier, fanzines were often a way of getting that delusions of grandeur, but the voice of the people element out there, that thing that you wouldn't necessarily see in more mainstream publications. So I think that would be my perspective on that. I think the fact that Knightmare ended was probably the push that I needed to go ahead and do the thing, because possibly I would have just sat on that as an idea and never actually done anything about it if Knightmare had continued.
So there we have the full story.
Of course, at one point, it was like, until the internet properly matured and we got the Knightmare website and everything, before that, the fanzine really was the only thing keeping the Knightmare dream, no pun intended, alive, really.
It was. I think that, again, to go back to the point you made earlier, Jake, about that sort of story element to the emotions around Knightmare ending. Again, I was in sort of fairly regular contact with Broadsword, just asking questions, really just, I think probably by modern definitions, it would be somewhere close to stalker, but it was all done with the best of intentions. It was really just this wild enthusiasm to find out what was happening next. And I remember having this mild sense of impending doom when they told me that Series 8 was going to be reduced, because I knew that there was a possibility leading up to that Knightmare was being discussed, that the future was being discussed about what it would have to be, what changes they would have to make. And then I remember I remember Series 8 starting and thinking it looked, I liked the look and feel of it. It looked more virtual, or a lot less of those sort of digitally altered photographs being used as rooms. And it felt like they'd spent a bit of money on it.
Mm.
So that sort of gave me confidence. And then when, was it called Cyberzone?
Virtually impossible.
Virtually Impossible, that was it. And I thought that was garbage. I really didn't enjoy it at all. And I thought, oh well, this is fine because this is the other idea. It's terrible. CITV are surely going to say, yeah, let's just stick with Knightmare. But then the wheels you would expect to start turning in 1995 just didn't start turning.
Yeah.
And then you have that sense of impending doom.
That's going to lead quite nicely into my little reminiscence. Martin, when you were saying there about the iShield being the thing keeping it alive, when I first started the online version, for about a year and a half, from the middle of 2001 until Challenge first got Knightmare at the end of 2002, pretty much every update on the Knightmare website by Nicholas Lamb was just my new iShield fanzine. And I was quite proud of that at the time. It's like, well, I am keeping Knightmare alive. Obviously, the challenge repeats. It reignited a lot of interest in Knightmare and a lot of new interest in Knightmare, which was great. I think it's pretty accurate to say that from like December 1995 to December 2002, the iShield was it. Right, I do want to share with you too briefly my little story about finding out that Knightmare ended. I'll try not to go on too much. And Martin's making a face.
Sorry.
No, I'd like to hear the story. I'm here for it, Jake.
Yeah, I would like to hear it as well. I wasn't intentionally making a face.
That's just your face.
I got a bit of apple stuck in my teeth. I was trying to get.
Unlike anyone who was sensible enough to be in the Knightmare Adventurers Club already and had thus heard there's a shortened 8th series of Knightmare, it's possibly going to be the last, I didn't know that. So I didn't find out that Knightmare had been cancelled until the very last few days of August 1995. Of course, I had my fears because of the shortened series, because of Virtually Impossible. Is this intended to be some kind of successor to Knightmare? I mean, whatever anyone says is what Tim Child wanted to do next, isn't it? And it's basically the same idea with better VR, more extensive use of VR. But yeah, of course, I remained hopeful that getting the Radio Times on that last Tuesday in August 1995, where the new series of Knightmare would be announced for the Friday week, it was going to be there and everything was going to be fine. But finally, it happened. I was in the back of a car driving down a road called the A29 on the outskirts of a place called Pulborough in West Sussex. Now, Martin, I believe you live in one of the 3 counties that borders West Sussex. Do you know the general area I'm talking about?
Not really, no. I don't. I've not really been to West Sussex much.
That's a shame you can't visualise me doing that. I was in the back of the car. My mum and Rosie were in the front, and I was reading the new Radio Times, looking at the new children's telly coming up, particularly on CITV, going to Friday. And what did I find there? Hoping to find Knightmare, of course. Funhouse. And then, of course, I get the cold dread. Where is Knightmare? Searching through all the days again. I haven't missed it, have I? It can't not be on Friday, can it? Finally, I had to accept, no, it's not there. And I started really getting worked up into quite a state about it. Now, I was 12 years old at this point. Knightmare had been one of the very most important parts of my life since I was 4. I was facing the harsh reality that it was no longer being made. My mum was forced to stop the car on a place called Wiganholt Common so I could get out and have a complete nervous breakdown. Now, I don't say this as hyperbole to exaggerate for effect, I really did have a complete nervous breakdown on Wigan Holt Common after reading that issue of the Radio Times. Now, I don't think Knightmare was the sole cause of this nervous breakdown. It was the last straw. There were a lot of changes I couldn't control going on in my life I didn't like during 1994, 95, and I felt, well, this is the last straw. I've lost it. My life no longer has any meaning. And thus I had my nervous breakdown. Eventually, I calmed down. My mum very kindly phoned Anglia Television to check what was going on. And it was then that I tried to join the Knightmare Adventurers Club to see if it was still happening. And of course, it wasn't. But I needed something. Some meaningful way to keep Knightmare alive, to keep it a part of my life. So thank goodness for Paul McIntosh and the iShield fanzine, because that's what filled that hole for me. I absolutely needed it at the time, and luckily, the way things worked out, there it was.
That was a good story.
Yeah, wow.
I wasn't aware of the iShield, to be honest, until I found the website, but I have since gone back and read like every single issue.
I should hope so.
Of course.
I think it's a strange thing that the things that we consciously or subconsciously, you can have things that are the absolute underpinning of your entire existence without realizing it. And I mean, in the last year, 18 months, I've lost two family members who were always just been sort of central pillars in my life. And obviously on the surface level, it's an awful thing when somebody dies. But I think that the dawning of my life is not going to ever be quite the same as it was. There is going to be this gap there and nothing will necessarily fill it. And over time, you come to learn that, life changes shape somewhat and your existence changes with it. But I think as an adult, that sort of threw me. It took me a long time to sort of stabilize myself again. But as somebody that age, 12, when you're right at the point where you are about to go into some sort of hormonal turmoil in terms of changing into a different person, and then to have something that sort of formed a core of your existence just whisked away. It's brutal, really.
That's right, it was.
Mm.
And one of the things I mentioned in the past year or so at that point was a family death.
Mm.
The first one I've really experienced. There have been others since, but yeah, as you say, as you grow up, you get used to the harsh realities of life. You get used to incorporating them into your life.
Yeah.
It's brutal.
I think for me, Nightmare's ending didn't have as much of a bigger impact on me as it did with you, because I, as a child, and now knowing now that this is an autistic trait, I didn't really have that great idea of time. So yeah, there would be breaks between series and I would just wait and watch whatever else was on, and then Nightmare would come back on. So by the time I realized that it wasn't coming back, I just sat there and waited for series 9, basically, and waited patiently, and Virtually Impossible was on, and I was like, my God, this is dreadful. But it was video games, so I still watched it. And then I think it slowly dawned on me that it wasn't coming back. But one memory I do have of Knightmare is going swimming after school one day and only realizing that I'd missed it on the way back, which may make you think that maybe it wasn't that important to me. But I remember the exact bit of road I was on when I realized I had missed it. And I was probably about 8 or 9 years old at the time. I still remember that exact piece of road, and I know exactly where it is.
Yeah, I have a similar thing with the A29 on the outskirts of Pulborough, which are a different memory, but similar, really.
Yeah.
That's interesting there, because we've all got a slightly different experience of coming to the end of Knightmare, coming to terms with the end of
I think age is a big factor there as well because, like, how old would you have been, Martin, at that point in 94, 95-ish?
So when Nightmare ended, I was 11 years old.
Yeah, it's I think like, for me because I was that little bit older because I was coming up to 17, 18 around then. So I think I was more able to sort of process it because I think you just naturally become a little bit more streetwise as you get older, and I think I was perhaps more able to read the signs that something bad is brewing here. Whereas I think when you're a child, you do just expect, well, this is how it's always been. I can't imagine an autumn Friday at 4:45 without that thing there because that's always been there.
Or even if you recognize some of the signs, even subconsciously, but don't want to accept them,
Yeah.
you could be full of hope right up until you open that Friday, the 8th of September 1995 or whatever it was in the Radio Times, and then it all comes crashing down. Being a bit more mature, you'd be able to come to terms with that more gradually. Paul, I know you didn't realise when we were first in touch how young I actually was.
Yeah.
When you sent me your videotape of the first half of Series 4, so I could copy the episode I was missing. And you said in your letter something like, oh, ignore all the stupid stickers and labels I've put all over the case. I was only 12 when I did that. And I thought, yes, I'm 12 now, and that's exactly the sort of thing I would do.
Yeah, I think it was because I don't think in our various exchanges we'd ever got around to talking about our age. So I think I just assumed you were older than that. And I think the fact that you were quite confidently talking about using SCART cables and so on to make a copy, I just thought, there's no way I would have been doing that as a 12-year-old. So I think I just assumed you were a bit older.
Yeah, that works out really well. My mum had just bought this SCART cable because she recorded a documentary about the Beatles that she wanted to keep. So she rushed to Argos and got this SCART cable. And I thought, hey, there's some series 1 to 3 knocking around on video in Newcastle upon Tyne. There's a SCART cable here. I see a connection. And things went on from there, really.
Yeah, it's a strange thing because I think you do certainly before the internet, your association with anything cultural like Knightmare is fairly insular in that you don't really get much of an opportunity to build a community around you, or you experience it on your own and you kind of assume naively that everyone's experience of it is fairly similar to your own. So the idea of people much younger than me at that point watching Knightmare was quite an alien concept because I think I just felt like because of who it was pitched at, that people would probably have grown up with it. But it's as you say, you started watching it when you were very young, Jake. Was it 4 or 5?
Oh, yeah, from the first episode.
Yeah, and I mean, when you watch some of those, because I rewatch them pretty regularly, and there's certain scenes, particularly the scenes with Mogdred, they're genuinely quite frightening. And they are the sort of things that will stay with you they're the sort of things that will give you sleepless nights. I nearly used the word nightmares, but I didn't. As a 5-year-old, the idea of wandering into Mogdred's little playpen or something like that.
Yeah, that was a big aspect of my early memories of Knightmare. Kind of being scared of it, unnerved by it at least. My particular, I don't want to meet that, were the wall monsters. I really liked watching the wall monsters. I was quite scared of them. When I was 4, I used to worry slightly. Now, is Granitas going to appear on this area of wall by the door above the sofa in my house? I don't think he is, but I'm not completely sure. That shows you how young I was when I first started watching it.
My brother Richard, he was I've got a really vivid memory of Ross's quest in Series 3, and when it all got a little bit tense at the end when he met Morgana and dropped off that narrow causeway. I can remember Richard basically it just got too much for him. He had to leave the room, and he went and sat at the bottom of the stairs and kind of waited for me to tell him, well, what he hoped was that they would have safely got out of the room. It just got too much for him. I'm thinking back then, that was 1989, so I was just coming up to 12. So he would have been in the region of 5 or 6 at that point. And yeah, it was just overwhelming for him at times, because it is a scary program. But certainly in the context of what else was being broadcast on CITV, it's certainly Funhouse is not quite as scary.
No.
Whatever your thoughts on Pat Sharp.
Although Pat Sharp's mullet.
The power of Knightmare to reach into your mind and heart is extraordinary, I think. And the age you are when you first see these things can influence a lot how it affects you. But it's always the same basic phenomenon of Knightmare really, really pressing those buttons and making those connections and resonating with people. It really is an extraordinary thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is why we're sitting here together today doing this.
It was lightning in a bottle, really. And that's the reason why any attempt to bring it back has failed so spectacularly, is that you could never do it again and have it have the same impact.
Absolutely. It's of its time.
I think I'm sure we all have spent time speculating about how it might work if it were to be brought back and what they could do with it, because I think that what they've done with, say, the Crystal Maze, they've made it a much more sort of arch-knowing version of what it used to be. And even when they did the Geek Week special, it had that sort of, I know they were trying to make it more knowing and more nods and winks, but that just irritated me. And I think it probably would irritate most Knightmare purists, because I don't want you to be taking this thing frivolously.
I agree, 100%.
It says a lot that during our interview with Tim Child, whilst we were talking about the Geek Week episode, a car crashed into my building.
Was that at that moment?
Yeah. It was like, oh no, they're talking about the Geek Week one. Quick, stop them. And I'm making light of the situation, but everyone was okay.
Weirdly, I can remember interviewing Tim Child for the Eye Shield, and I think at the time, because my dad was extremely strict about using the phone, and at the time, if you made a phone call outside of your own city, you would get charged quite a lot more for it.
Yeah.
And I was quite concerned, and I remember speaking to Tim Child's PA, and basically just brazen cheek, just saying, would you mind footing the bill for this call? Would you mind calling me back? And then, and she just said, yes, that'll be fine. And then she gave me a time and a number to call when I was ready. And then in the end, I just got directly through to Tim Child and just interviewed him. And I remember that entire interview just having at the back of my mind, Dad's not going to like this. This is going to be expensive.
You know, those interviews you did with David Lerner, Hugo Myatt, Tim Child, Jason Carl were so important and so insightful back then, pre-internet. It's the only kind of insider info on Knightmare that anyone had access to for a great many years. So they were an excellent part of that original paper fanzine.
I really enjoyed doing that as well. It was because, you know, the much like you just said, Martin, with Tim, that I know people always say never meet your heroes, but sometimes it's absolutely great. And you get to have those conversations and ask questions. And other than Tim, I think all of the rest of mine were done by post. So I'd just send a list of questions and they would answer.
Yeah.
There were a couple that I really wanted to try and get and never succeeded. I really wanted to get Paul Valentine because I felt like he would have, because he sort of spanned different eras and played lots of different characters. I was quite keen to get his input, but he never responded.
Yeah, we're still trying to get Paul Valentine. Have you had anyone else turn you down or not respond?
John Woodnut as well. I think at that point, I think he Knightmare was very much just another job for him, and I don't think he really had that much interest in responding.
Yeah, I always got the idea that it was very much a thing that he did, and then it was over.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've I think the only person we've tried to contact that has outright turned us down was Akash Ramtari,
Oh,
and I just get the idea that he just doesn't want to talk about the show at all.
Now, isn't that very, very understandable?
Yeah, yeah. To be fair,
I mean, I think on the show he answers any question you might want to ask him with the phrase, "I don't know, I ain't got a clue." That sums it up perfectly.
yeah. So I watched that episode fairly recently. I don't know. I kind of got the impression that from the word go, that as a team they didn't really take it particularly seriously at all. They just seemed to be sort of giggling their way through the whole experience. And teams like that often really irritated me because I just would watch them thinking, why is this not me?
yeah.
But then clearly they must have auditioned well.
Yeah, I mean they clearly didn't get any questions right in the clue room, so they clearly went back and recorded that scene with the troll because that was just completely out of nowhere.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that would have been the opportunity to show us what being killed by a wall monster would have looked like, and they chose not to do it.
Yeah, I'd have liked to see that when I was 5 and when I was 12 and watching that on the Paul McIntosh tapes.
I think Martineau said it best when he said that a wall monster death would have been a bit of an anticlimax.
Yeah,
because they wouldn't have had the animation of the wall monster actually doing anything to the Dungeoneer, so it would have just been a life force drain.
yeah, it would have been much like Mogdred's playpen.
Yeah,
just starvation or whatever you would call it.
There were a few in the books.
Yes, there were. I remember.
You can get eaten by Granitas in the first 3 Knightmare books, quest section. Now, as we've touched on in the conversation so far, the Ice Shield fanzine did launch shortly after Knightmare didn't come back in 1995. Now, this should have been a wonderful, perfect opportunity for the fanzine to have hundreds of readers.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that I was one of the regular readers that did manage to find out about it and engage with it, I think comes from the fact that I wasn't originally part of the Knightmare Adventurers Club. I did inquire at that stage in September, and so was told, no, the Knightmare Adventurers Club is ending, but Paul McIntosh is hoping to carry it on with this fanzine. Now, every member of the Knightmare Adventurers Club who was already a part of it should have had that information.
Correct.
But they didn't. And what an absolute cock-up that was.
Yeah, that was so frustrating because it did not, because again, I've made this reference a lot of times, but in the pre-internet times, it's hard for people to imagine now, but it was so hard to reach people in any kind of large numbers. I remember there was a sci-fi magazine that I took out a couple of adverts in, just, classified ads. But Knightmare and sci-fi, I think on the surface might appear to have quite an overlap, but in reality they don't, and they never did. It was a kind of again, going back to that lightning in a bottle thing. It wasn't a game show, but it wasn't really a Dungeons and Dragons style sci-fi show in the way that perhaps some people thought it might be. It had its own unique place, so there wasn't really an established community that I could go out to and say, come and see this new thing that I'm doing. So my best chance of that was the existing Adventurers Club, and had lots of regular dialogue, and they said that they were going to put something in the final issue of the quest to sort of point people my way, and then just didn't do it. And I think then they wrote to me and apologized and said they'd completely forgotten to do it. And I think that there was like a later batch of issues that they sent out, and they put a little pink slip of paper in with the magazine just to point people my way. But that was, I think, in the tens rather than the hundreds. So in your case, Jake, that was just a kind of it wasn't even part of the club. It was just that they happened to write back to you.
That's right. I wrote to inquire, and they pointed me your way because they were closing up. Quite a lucky piece of timing in all senses.
Yeah, it really is. There was I think, and I never actually saw it, but I was told that, because I contacted the Sci-Fi Channel and I knew they were repeating Knightmare, so I asked them if there was any way they could make reference to it. And I think a kind of address at the end of one or two episodes steering people. And I mean, basically, they just broadcast my parents' address on a national TV channel, which looking back was a weird thing to do. But they did that, and I got a handful of people who contacted me saying that they'd seen it on the Sci-Fi Channel, so it must have happened. I just didn't have the channel, so I didn't see it.
Perhaps your neighbours saw it.
And then failed to tape it.
Now, I really enjoyed thinking every 3 months, oh, it's time for the eye shield. I must find a 50p, sellotape it to a piece of card, and send a stamped self-addressed envelope to Newcastle upon Tyne. And eventually, of course, for the final 4 issues, I got round to subscribing. So I didn't have to bother doing that anymore. But I quite enjoyed the process of, it's like popping down to the local paper shop for your favourite comic. It's time to get that. Really very special. But I don't think all the original readers bothered to remember to do this on a regular basis, did they?
No,
and thus the reader numbers dropped.
Yeah, I think that is just one of the laws of capitalism, I suppose. But unless you're in a position to constantly advertise, then the only way is down. And so the numbers started off, it never got into the hundreds, but it was in the sort of maybe 50, 60 people got the first issue and then stayed with it for a few, but then it just gradually ebbed away. And it's always been a regret of mine, because I think that frustrated me in the sense that I felt like, this was a good thing and we had a nice community there, but it was just dwindling, and I felt so powerless. And the only people I could really vent about this to were the loyal people who had stayed with the thing. So it's just a shame. But then that is just how these things go when you're operating from basically zero, and there's no such thing as the internet at this point, and there's no way of reaching out and advertising it any further. It was always going to end that way, but yeah, it was fun while it lasted.
To produce 9 issues over 2 years is an extraordinary achievement by anyone's standard. All done by post, of course, we must remember that. And when I was reading through my paper copies of the Eye Shield issues 1 to 9, which I still have, which moved house with me from Hertfordshire to East Anglia, which was about a year ago, I was struck by a sobering realization. Well, it's not like I didn't know it before, but when I was doing the Eye Shield, any contributions I got, people used to send me as email attachments, Word documents, or pasted into the text of an email, and I would copy and paste and edit, and that was quite easy to do. When I was reading issues 1 to 9, I thought, wow, Paul McIntosh has actually had to type all this out. Not only the articles he's written himself, but the contributions, the stories, the puzzles are mainly retyped by Paul. Now, what an extraordinary labour of love that must have been.
Yeah, I hadn't considered it in that way, but I mean, equally, it is also true that every single thing that people contributed was invariably handwritten as well, which again is a sort of testament to the love that the readers had for it. And I can remember the handwritten things that you and Rosie would submit, and I've completely lost contact with him since those days, but Tim Morris used to send artwork in. Every now and then he would send sort of story type things, but he just seemed to have a hobby of some really beautiful Knightmare based artwork. And I literally would and it feels horrible now just describing it, but I used to have to sort of pick the best bits and then just get a pair of scissors, cut the images out, and then stick them onto the page so that my dad could take them to work and photocopy them. But it was a very DIY approach to the whole thing.
That was the further thought I had, because as some of the credits tell us in the paper Eye Shields, your dad does the photocopying to get the physical issues made. I believe you weren't even able to type the things on the a computer in your own house.
Yeah.
And it was done on Ray's computer.
My uncle Ray actually passed away earlier this year, and it was a thing that came up at the funeral we were talking about, my regular visits to their house, because even that was a bit of a trek, because they lived sort of down towards Sunderland, so it was a train and a couple of buses to get there. And then I would sort of come armed with folders full of things that people had sent, and then sit down at that computer and sort of cobble it all together. And then you're trying to sort of write things and format them in a way that leaves enough space for the exact dimensions of the pictures that I'd already planned to put in. And then just kind of hope that you're going to get those things right. And if not, you're going to have to rewrite the whole thing and print it again.
What a difference to copying and pasting into Word documents and sending them to Nicholas Lamb as email attachments. And later I started having publisher access to the site and uploading them myself. But what a completely different process. And I've learned a completely new piece of information there. I always imagined Ray with his computer as a friend, neighbour, who you pop round next door to use his computer. But he was actually an uncle.
Yes, yeah.
And he has a different surname from you.
Yeah.
That helped to add to that impression for me. Of course, uncles often do have a different surname, but it helped me to imagine him as, oh yeah, Paul's friend next door, saying, yeah, come around and use my computer whenever you want. And, oh God, here he is again. But it wasn't quite like that.
Without access to that, then it just would have been a non-starter entirely.
Another thing you said on a previous podcast, Paul, was how you appreciated how I kept in the online version many of your regular features that you started. And I thought to myself, well, really? I kept all of them because I wanted to see the iShield continue very much as the same entity and fill in all those gaps in chronicling Knightmare that it hadn't yet done. That was the point of the iShield to me, as a kind of retrospective look back at all the different things, wallow in the nostalgia. And I know a big part of the paper version was the Bring Back Knightmare campaign and trying to do something with Knightmare's future as well as past. But by then we had the website to do that sort of thing. So I thought, well, this is great. In the online version, I can just do the nostalgia, carry on all those regular features, and chronicle the whole thing. And that's what I did over the course of 10 years. And I very much enjoyed doing it. And I'm very proud of what I produced there. I think justly so. Perhaps over the course of 10 years online, you get about the same amount of actual physical labour as 2 years doing it all on paper. So I think we've both achieved something extremely special there.
Yeah, and I think it's only really when you both touched on it earlier, that sense that there was a period of the best part of a decade, really, where that was the sole new thing that was happening. That was the one thing that was kind of a strand that connected the end of Knightmare to the kind of online community that exists now. And Labour of Love is the perfect expression for it, because certainly it wasn't for any kind of award-winning plaudits or money or anything like that. It was just purely because you just wanted to know that this thing was being documented. And it was because I remember making the first issue, and you have visions of, well, by the time I've done the last issue, I'll have done everything. I'll have covered every episode. I will have covered every possible remember this kind of room or challenge. And then of course it dawns on you that would mean I'd probably still be just putting the finishing touches to one of the issues now. And it's a great thing that it exists. I'm really proud, and I loved seeing the work that you had done with it, Jake, because it felt like it, from my point of view, it had to end, because at that point I was at university and I was, being taken off in all sorts of different directions, and it just felt like it was becoming more and more the case that, with the exception of you and Rosie and one or two others, that there was no new content coming in, so it was harder and harder to actually pull an issue together. So it felt like it was the paper version came to its sort of natural conclusion, but spiritually it didn't have to come to an end at that point. I'm really glad that it didn't.
I'm really glad you're glad, because it was very important to me to do, and as the Ice Shield creator, I very much wanted you to be on board with that. Of course, I could never have done a paper version. As you say, the whole concept of that had run its course. But with the internet, that's a whole new way to do it, an easier way to do it in practical terms. And I kind of knew I wouldn't get many contributions for it. It would mostly be me writing it, but I was fine with that because of the scale I was doing it on. I knew I could cope with that. But I was pleased when I did get some contributions, stories, little articles, opinions, and I was pleased to be able to maintain that kind of fanzine element to some extent. One thing I was particularly pleased about was that I did manage to finish off all the stories that were left unfinished at the end of issue 9 over the course of the first year or so after I relaunched the Ice Shield. The authors of the 2 or 3 stories that were left got in touch and said, "Oh, my story was unfinished in the Ice Shield. Would you put it in the online version?" And I said, yes, I'd be pleased to. And of course, I then didn't have to sit and retype the story. I did my old copy and paste, but it was wonderful to have them there. And in the case of Love Worms, which was unfinished in issue 9, Rosie actually sat and wrote for me on a laptop a new ending for it. We didn't have the old paper copy of it, which doubtless had been handwritten or perhaps written on a typewriter and sent to Newcastle all those years ago.
I remember having I went through a lot of things up in the loft a couple of years ago and found folders full of original Ice Shield content, including lots of handwritten stuff from you, Jake, and from Rosie. And there was a story that Rosie had written, which, I mean, looking back, I mean, she's your younger sister, isn't she?
Yes.
So she must have been very young at that point. And it's extremely sweet, this story, because after every line from a character, there's a little thing in parentheses describing the emotion, almost like a stage direction. So there'll be a line from Lord Fear, and then it would have in brackets sarcastic, and then it would have another line. So it was almost written like a stage script, but it was lovely to think, because at the time I don't think I really appreciated these are very young people who are making these contributions and are engaging with this thing. And yeah, it's very nice to look back on.
Rosie will love to hear that. When she was contributing to the paper Ice Shield, yeah, she was aged 10 to 12 and starting to really get very keen on creative writing. She'd always been quite keen on it. She was really wanting to develop her skills. And she did do a lot of Knightmare stories as part of that. And we both enjoyed very much contributing as a way of keeping in touch with Knightmare and of furthering our own development creatively. So it was absolutely invaluable for both of us during that time. I did really appreciate, Paul, the way that you said in those Series 4 podcasts, the relationship with people like Jake and Rosie Collins turns into part contributor, part pen pal.
Yeah, it did feel like that.
I did find that aspect of it very important as well. I used to tell you little things about when I was moving house and so on, and you used to tell me about your university, and it was nice just to have that aspect in addition to the Knightmare.
Yeah, I think it's that community thing, isn't it? It becomes more than just the original thing that brings you together. That's how these things ought to be, and it's nice, and it's nice that we've been able to sort of stay in touch via this platform as well. I think it's a Knightmare as an entity. When you look at the Dave Morris books and the way that the programs are scripted, it's an excellent platform for creative writing, because with the audio plays that you've been releasing on the podcast stream as well, there's so much that is unaddressed and unspoken, and there's references to, like, I remember I watched an episode recently where Morgana has moved into this realm, or moved from the old realm or something like that.
Morgana has moved from the old realm and entered the dungeon via the deeper catacombs.
That's the only reference to Morgana's kind of backstory. And you can be so creative with that. You can take that in any direction you want.
Mm.
And the backstory to, Mogdred sort of ceding power to Lord Fear as the de facto opposition. Traegard's backstory before arriving at Knightmare Castle. There's so much which is kind of touched upon, but you can kind of just take it and run a million miles with it.
There's so much in there, isn't there? This is why I feel I kind of met Knightmare in the middle in terms of the age it was pitched at and the age I was at about Series 6, which is when I used to start to write little extra scenes between Lord Fear and Skarkill, and Lord Fear and Dreadnought, and so on. And that was where writing about Knightmare, using Knightmare creatively, really started for me and continued on into the Eye Shield. And without Knightmare being on the telly anymore, I really needed the Eye Shield to keep that going in a meaningful way. So thank God for it.
Yeah, and I think it helped me a lot as well, because it for that exact same reason, that feeling of not only the community element of feeling that you can sort of reach out and connect with other people to whom it mattered, but also just that outlet to sort of take things in a slightly different direction. I think I wrote a couple of short stories in there, but it was
Pickle, the milk's frozen again.
yes, that's right.
There's your punchline.
Yeah, that was just one long gag, basically, wasn't it? But yeah, I think that scope to do that, and just to sort of, when you lose something like Knightmare, which is so really important to you, you can just put it to one side and think, oh, well, that was fun. Never think about that again. Or you can use it as a trigger to be creative and to come up with, whether that is the sort of the fan fiction type things that we've talked about, or whether that is creating a fanzine, or just digging that bit deeper into how it was made, the technology behind it, which was in its own right was incredible in the context of what else was being made at that time. And still to this day, when I talk to people about it who don't know what the program is, that's the thing I have to keep trying to emphasize, because clearly virtual reality and blue screen technology are so common now that it doesn't blow anyone's mind, but it's really hard to emphasize just how mind-blowing it was to see somebody apparently walking into this landscape in the 1980s, when we just didn't see that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's another reason why I don't think it could work today, because we've seen it all. You can just put on a headset now and be in another world.
Knightmare has always been the anchor of my heart and soul and creativity. I have noticed other shows I've liked ending along the way and just think, all right, that's the end of the Dreamstone, is it? That's not coming back. Okay, then. But with Knightmare, that was never going to be the case. I was always going to have to find that way to stay in touch with it. Before Knightmare, for me, it was He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Then Knightmare comes in and completely takes over. My mum persuaded me to sit and watch the first episode of Knightmare in 1987 so she could have 25 minutes more peace from her 4-year-old. I don't know what 2-year-old Rosie was doing, probably sleeping. But I think that sometimes through the rest of her life, my mum came to regret that decision to persuade me to watch Knightmare because it did lead to some scenes, to some trouble for her, to having to stop the car on Wiganholt Common for me to have a nervous breakdown, to buying lots of videotapes for me to put it on, arranging for me to watch an episode of Series 2 at a neighbour's house while she took Rosie to the doctors, having me come into her place of work in the noughties to send the Eye Shield to Nicholas Lamb, while she was trying to do her school secretary work. Oh, can I just use your computer for half an hour to send the eye shield to Nicholas Lamb? Yes, I suppose so. And off she goes to do something else. It was a profound moment deciding to watch that first episode of Knightmare, and its consequences are far-reaching. But overall, I'm extremely grateful for that.
It's interesting how the way you're describing it, Jake, that your first encounter with Knightmare and your first encounter with the Eye Shield both seem sort of marked by happenstance. That it's just a collection of circumstances that led you there, and you do sometimes wonder. I mean, I'm not particularly a big believer in fate, but sometimes you do think, was it always meant to be that you were going to be on this path where Knightmare would be so central to your life?
I do have thoughts like that. I find the evidence of the possibility of that sort of thing, like Traegard does in the first Knightmare book, very, very compelling. I used to enjoy watching the adverts when I was little. If I'd been watching something like DuckTales, I believe it was, before the first episode of Knightmare, I used to watch the adverts afterwards and enjoy the adverts and look for my favourite adverts. So that's why the telly was still on when Knightmare was about to begin. And my mum thought, oh, I can get him to watch another programme, even though it's the 4:40 programme for older children, and shut him up for another 25 minutes, and he'll watch the adverts after that as well. Why don't you try this new thing, darling? Knightmare. Why don't I? Fate decreed that I should. And I don't think it would be an exaggeration to call it the most significant moment in my life for how things were going to continue from there. For the mainstay that was going to embed itself in my life and stay forevermore.
Would you say, do you have an equivalent of that, Martin? Do you have a thing that you have that came to an end and you sort of felt like you really had to process it? You had to sort of mourn its loss a little bit? Because the only other thing that springs to mind for me is I was a really devout fan of my ZX Spectrum, and there was a magazine called Your Sinclair.
Yeah.
It was very, it was quite sort of smash hits inspired in its sort of humor and silliness. Did you play a lot of video games at that point in your life, Jake?
No. I never had a computer in my house until the late 90s. And I never really particularly connected Knightmare with computer games. Obviously, it's intended to be a living computer game, but I never really realised that. And the immersive, interactive adventure is what really makes it work, I think. So you don't necessarily have to be a video game fan to appreciate it. It's well beyond a video game. It never was to me.
Yeah, I think that's true for me as well. I got my first ever video game type thing was the Spectrum, and that was, I think, 1990-ish, when the Spectrum was already very much on the wane. The other glitzier things were coming along to take its place, but I suppose much like Knightmare, I stayed loyal to the Spectrum to the bitter end. And yeah, I got really vivid memories of the final issue of Your Sinclair coming out, and that again took me a little while to come to terms with, because it just felt like I could see the direction of travel. The magazine was more like a pamphlet than a magazine by the end, because there were no new games to review. There was nothing going on. There was no market for it anymore. But again, much like watching old episodes of Knightmare, every now and then I will get an old issue of that magazine out just to bathe in the nostalgia of it all. It's
no exaggeration to say it is a form of love.
Absolutely.
A building block of your being. And let's press Martin for his example, like Paul was asking.
Yes, to answer your question, my version of your Sinclair would have been Club Nintendo, which was a mail order only magazine for people who owned Nintendo systems. I had a Game Boy at the time, so I sent off this thing and got this magazine once a month. And looking back on it, the magazine was absolute because it was produced by and paid for by Nintendo. So every review that they had in it was extremely biased. But one good thing it did have was the player's guides where they would map out the entire level. And that's something that your Sinclair used to do a lot as well.
I don't know if you ever noticed, Paul, but I was so inspired by your original iShield features that I kind of created a third version of Remember Him, Remember This with creature feature.
Yes, I do remember that, yeah.
Which was doing the same sort of thing for the creatures and monsters and using the same scores as well. And that was adapted from an original Creatures Gallery feature, which has one attempt at kicking it off where Tim Morris draws cavern whites and writes a few little facts about them. And I thought, well, I could expand this into a regular feature. And so I did. And that was a big part of trying to finish off everything that the iShield had tried to kick off. But even after all these years, there is one loose end that I would like to come back to. And that is something that was teased a couple of times in the iShield, first in the paper version, and then when I interviewed you by email for the new version. And that is the story of Paul McIntosh's second Knightmare audition. Now, doubtless this happened about 31 years ago, but perhaps you can tell us anything you remember of it now, and finally close the book on that old TES loose end.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that when you tease something in that way, you kind of assume I've probably told the story, and actually I've never have. So yeah, here it is at long last.
I've always wanted to know about
it. The details get slightly blurry because I had two auditions, and I'm trying not to let them sort of merge into one. The first one was in Leeds, and I remember three of us travelled together on the train, and one by car, and he was running late.
Now, in the magazine, you say it's 2 on the train, 2 in the car.
I was a 2 in the... Yes, because I could travel free on the train because my dad worked for British Rail. So that meant the train travel was the obvious way to go. But yeah, we felt like we were on the back foot a little bit from the word go there because we ended up being pushed to the back because they got in touch with the hotel, which was in Otley in Leeds, I remember. And they contacted the hotel and managed to get word through to Tim and Sue Child to say that they were running late, but it felt like we were in a bit of a race against time. But the second one, yes, this was me and Richard, my brother. We each nominated a friend who wanted to join us, and we thought that might work because we'd seen a couple of times where Knightmare seemed to like to have a bit of an age mixture within the teams. It made them a bit more two-dimensional, I think. And yeah, that one was in Manchester. So that was, again, a bit more of a trek. And again, we went by train. But my nominated friend, Russell, his dad basically said, because you had to fund your own travel, they weren't going to pay your expenses to get there. And my friend, Russell, who I've kind of lost contact with now, but his dad said, I'm not driving you all the way to Manchester, or I'm not paying for a train. So my friend Mark, who I'm still close friends with to this day, his dad also worked for British Rail, so he could also travel for free on the trains. But by that point, we'd already submitted our forms. We had Russell as a named team member, and you had to send in a passport photograph. Mark didn't really look very much like Russell, but he had to go there and pretend to be Russell for the day. And we just hoped that they would think it was it wasn't a particularly good photograph, or he'd had a haircut or something. But yeah, we went, and I felt like I really learned from the first experience. I felt like I'd been a bit too quiet, a little bit too overawed. So I really thought, right, well, we'll just go for it. We'll be bullish. We'll talk through things. We'll be very verbal all the way through. And it was a similar setup to the first time. We were taken to like a conference room where Tim Child and it was, I don't remember Sue Child being there this time. There was somebody else who worked for Broadsword, and they kind of just verbally described a scenario for us. And then we would talk through the challenge, talk through our different options. And I felt really confident coming out of there. I felt like we'd worked well as a team. We'd talked through everything. We'd given clear answers. We'd got everything right, and we'd solved the puzzle. And then again, I suppose going back again to that thing of the expecting Series 9 to come along, I think I was just every time the phone rang or I got a letter in the post, I was thinking, this is it. This is the moment when I get invited to be on Knightmare. And then I just got this sort of standard photocopied letter saying, thank you for coming. Sorry, you haven't been successful. And I think at that point, that was the last one that I could go for, because at that point I was at the top of the age threshold. So that was it. I knew then that was my final chance of being and gone. So
did they offer you the chance to be on Time Busters instead? Because a few people who auditioned for Knightmare also got the chance to appear on Time Busters.
They didn't, but they did. They mentioned that they were doing that, and they said that initially they were using people who were reasonably local, because I think they had quite short call times or something.
Yeah.
Something which meant that they didn't have a filming schedule that was planned out a long time ahead like they did for Knightmare, so they had to kind of just bring people in who could get there at fairly short notice.
In one of the paper issues, Paul, you tried to launch the big issue where people would write in and vote on, in that case specifically, which of two kind of similar characters was the favourite.
Yeah.
And as it was very difficult to run a kind of interactive fanzine at that point, I don't think it really took off with people actually joining in, getting people to join in. That's the tricky part. But I did continue the big issue, comparing similar characters with similar roles, Pickle and Majida, Skarkill and Lissard, although now I think actually it's invalid to compare Skarkill to Lissard without comparing Skarkill to Lissard and Raptor, as they both take half Skarkill's role. But I did think perhaps we could introduce a big issue here at the end of this podcast to kind of revive the spirit of the iShield fanzine. The listeners of Illusion vote on Twitter. Could be a simple yes or no answer to the issue I've come up with here, and we three could give our thoughts on it first.
I can remember I can remember the thought process leading into doing that, which was essentially exactly as you described, just to sort of provoke people into some sort of engagement and contact. And if you keep things fairly binary or fairly simple, then it's often then people just think, oh, well, I'll just vote for this or vote for that, and they don't need to write an essay about it. But I think I always as well wrestled in my head a lot with Mogdred versus Lord Fear, because I really loved Mogdred as a character and still do. And I think that sort of increasingly pantomime villain aspect that Lord Fear took on, I just struggled with, because I felt like he became the embodiment of the change of Knightmare as it progressed. And that as I've got older, I can, make my peace with that and understand why they did it. But I think probably with things like that, I would be just thinking, I just wanted other people to come along and agree with me, essentially.
They're both so appropriate and tailored to the half of Knightmare they're in.
Yeah.
Mogdred and Lord Fear. Mogdred, I always say this, I've said it on this podcast, Mogdred is in 11 episodes, Lord Fear is in 53, both out of potentially 56. You can see the whole different concept of the role of like a chief baddie with how the gameplay is going. Mogdred lurks in the shadows. That's the scary atmosphere of the early series. Lord Fear gives away all his plans in Spyglass sequences in all but 3 episodes of Knightmare's second half. That's how the gameplay is working there. And it's a big part of it, appealing to a younger audience, being accessible to a younger audience. So I always find it very hard to pick like a favourite between those two, because they're both kind of embodiments of their half of Knightmare, and I like them both a lot for what they do and when they do it.
Yeah. So did you have a big issue in mind for us to go at now?
Yes, I do. And Martin, you might put one of your Twitter polls. I've come up with a little issue that people may like to vote, yes or no. Not comparing 2 characters in this case, but with the question, is it possible that Merlin and Mogdred do not exist physically independently of each other, but share the same body? Is it possible that when we see Merlin on Knightmare, Mogdred is completely inactive, and when we see Mogdred, Merlin can pop into the room because he is within that same being, but dormant?
Okay. Yeah, so like a magical Norman Bates type scenario.
Yeah.
Doesn't Merlin once describe Mogdred as is it his outer ego, that the expression that he uses?
Mogdred, my alter ego. He is the dark side of my nature and of my magic. He lies ahead and below and must be overcome.
It's easy to think that Merlin and Mogdred are just opposites with two different bodies, and they can and perhaps have met at times. In Martineau's audio plays, this is certainly the case, and it's a very valid interpretation. But an idea I've become increasingly interested in over the years, I've thought about it, is perhaps Merlin and Mogdred don't exist independently of each other, but are different protrusions of the same being in the same body.
You never see them in the same room together, and they both seem to have similar powers, just used in different ways.
Exactly. It's an idea I played with at the end of my new Lost series special, you may have noticed, Martin.
Yeah.
Where you were being Mogdred and I was being Merlin. And it's no coincidence that I played with it there, because I've been thinking about it. If we think back to series 1, where Merlin describes Mogdred as his alter ego, there's a great deal of evidence that the end of a series 1 quest is going to be you bring down the wall of Jericho with the horn, Mogdred appears, the opposite spell is cast, and he turns into Merlin, who says, "Congratulations, you won," like in the first Knightmare book. David Rowe's Art of Knightmare is kind of evidence to support this, where he calls the Wall of Jericho room. It's been given to him to draw as Wall of Jericho / Mogdred room. Mogdred will appear here. Treguard describes it as the final hurdle. That's the final challenge. Use the horn to bring down the Wall of Jericho, change Mogdred into Merlin. And Mogdred would be pre-recorded for that scene, just standing there threatening the Dungeoneer, so that John wouldn't have to literally play two characters at once. Which very much suggests to me the original idea is they at least can, even if they don't always, share a body. You can hear Merlin say in Series 1 about Mogdred, "Overcome him as you may, and we may yet meet again." That's actually a sequence of events, I've come to think. Overcome Mogdred, and then we will meet again, because you'll turn him into me.
Yeah.
When Merlin says in Series 1, on level 2, "If you survive all, we shall meet once again," I used to think, well, that means if you survive far enough into level 3, we'll meet again. But it literally means if you survive all, the entire quest, we'll meet again, and I've told you, you won.
And 90% of the interactions with Mogdred aren't actually directly with Mogdred. They're an astral projection of Mogdred, which kind of lends credence to the theory that Merlin may be off doing something else. So, yeah, even if they share the same body, they're not necessarily sharing the same consciousness.
Yes, Merlin physically could be somewhere doing something and projecting that part of himself into the quest that we see. So that's even further evidence in favour of this little theory.
Yeah.
Over the years, I've come to like it more and more as a theory, and I do now believe it's kind of what they intended in the first series of Knightmare. I'd like to know from the listeners of Illusion on Twitter, yes or no, do Merlin and Mogdred share a body?
I'll put forward the alternative view, which is that I think they are inextricably linked without actually being one and the same. I think I've always interpreted it as almost existing as one another's kryptonite, or, loath as I am to use the reference, a bit like the Harry Potter and Voldemort thing of there is some connection between them that will invariably bring them together, but without necessarily having to be in the same place. So I don't think I've ever really been able to wrap my head fully around the idea that they are one and the same, just projecting different aspects of one another, but they are two entities that are connected and almost unable to be around one another. And if one is there, then the other cannot be there without being the same person.
That way of interpreting it is much more useful for like creative writing and audio playmaking things. And I think they're both very valid and very interesting ways to interpret the alter ego concept. So let's, the three of us, vote now. Do Merlin and Mogdred share a body? I vote yes.
I did think no, but you've kind of convinced me round to the other way of thinking, really.
I'm going to stick with no. I'm going to go with it. I'll be the opposite in this instance.
Yeah, that's excellent. It wouldn't be much good if we came out like 3-0, would it?
No.
To get people wanting to vote for their own answers. So listeners of Illusion, you vote for that on Twitter, one way or the other. Make a commitment. Do Merlin and Mogdred share a body? Yes or no? And I'd be very interested to see the results of that.
I think we're kind of getting to the wrapping up stage. But my question for you both is, do you think the Eye Shield will ever come back in any form? Will there be like the equivalent of a Geek Week special or something?
I think actually the Geek Week special is a good point. That maybe as a one-off, I could see it working quite well as a kind of you could almost go full meta and have a Remember This feature on the Eye Shield itself. But yeah, I think it's at the point where we, between us, and I'm saying that as when I'm fully aware that Jake has covered a lot more ground than I have, but between us we have covered so much of the Knightmare content that is available and out there, and now we have this podcast and other similar outlets. I think it would be hard to bring it back as a regular thing with any new points to make or new ground to cover. But I think as a one-off, or as occasional one-offs, and reflecting on even the Geek Week special or on other bits and pieces, I think that could work. But yeah, what about you, Jake?
I've always said, if ever I've been asked anything like that, which hasn't been that often, definitely no. I was very keen in the middle of 2011 to wrap up, finish off. I was pleased to have got to the point of documenting everything in the right place. And I thought, right, yeah, that's it. That's what I wanted it to do all along, and that's how it should stay. I was at first at that point thinking, maybe I could come back to the Eye Shield section of the website occasionally and do odd bits, even if it's not a regular thing. But then I really got to the stage of wanting to put it to bed completely. If you'll forgive me for just referencing another tragic event, in March 2011, my mother passed away very suddenly, which, as you can imagine, was an extremely devastating experience. And I was at that stage kind of wrapping up the last 3 issues of the Eye Shield. And I was thinking, right, well, this definitely has to be it then. I have no more energy emotionally to devote to the Eye Shield. It's done everything it needed to do. I just kind of want to put it aside as a kind of distraction to this whole new world I'm having to adjust to. So I did kind of run out of steam a bit there after that extreme event in my life. And I was quite glad to kind of think, right, well, I've done an excellent job there, but it's done. However, now, that idea of a retrospective The Eye Shield about the Eye Shield could work. In many ways, I think perhaps this podcast may be it. In a new form, in a new way, doing it verbally, releasing it as part of this Temporal Discussion podcast, which has successfully reached a very wide audience. I think that's probably the best way to do it, really, rather than try and write it down and get it released online as a PDF or whatever.
We did toy with the idea of asking you both if we could call the podcast The Eye Shield. and make it like an official thing.
That wouldn't have been a bad idea, really, would it? It's kind of a continuation of the same thing, the same intention in this world of the 2020s.
Yeah, I think that would be quite nice, actually. Yeah, I like the idea of it being almost a sort of audio issue.
Okay.
It feels quite appropriate.
So let's call this the iShield issue. I'm not sure where we're up to now.
71.
The iShield issue 71, the Geek Week special.
Could maybe drop in a signpost to say where all the issues are.
Yeah, so you can still find all the issues of the iShield on Knightmare.com, including the original paper issues that have been digitized and, of course, Jake's online version.
Somewhere on the Knightmare forum, there's still, I believe, in the iShield section, an index that I wrote. So if you want to find a particular character or quest or creature, you can reference there which issue to find its Remember This, Remember Him, Classic Quest, Poetry Corner. It is all catalogued.
And helping me with the admin today is my daughter, Shayla. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please give us a rating and review on your platform of choice. It really helps us to grow our audience by reaching others who might be interested. You can follow us on Twitter, we're at NightmarePod, and our Mastodon is topspicy.social/@NightmarePod.
If you want to support the podcast, we're NightmarePod on Patreon. Speaking of Patreon, here's a shout out to Keepers of the Book of Quests, David N. Rabbit, Paul McIntosh, Peter Polsford and Scott Evans.
Advisors Kim Harder, which is a silly surname, Kim Stewart Crossley, Lord Entropy where the O is a 0, Paul Craddy, Peter Sidon, Benjamin Bloom and David Thompson.
And let's not forget Dungeoneers, Peter Corridge and Adam Battersby.
Support us on Patreon at Dungeoneer level or above to get your name mentioned in the podcast. Higher level perks also receive merchandise, have access to exclusive episodes, and if you pledge as a Keeper of the Book of Quests, we'll even offer you the chance to be a guest on the podcast.
Our website is nightmarepod.co.uk.
If you're looking for Temporal Discussion merchandise, including t-shirts, stickers, and other products, it's at nightmarepod.redbubble.com.
You can email us at podcast@nightmarepod.co.uk.
And just keep telling yourself.
It's only a podcast.
Isn't it?
This is really boring, Martin.
One moment. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I will be right back.
He's obviously very bored now.